So help me God. So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Hello, everybody. My name is Rob Lee. Thank you for tuning in to So Help Me Pod, a partnership between Beloved Journal and my school, Pacific School of Religion, where I am working on the presidential theologies and faiths of the men who have served in their office and how their theologies and faiths have been impacted and have impacted public policy in our country. Today I wanted to bring you a bonus episode about the presidential line of succession. Why am I doing that? Why does that matter on a day like today? Well, last night, the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, Kevin McCarthy, was ousted by the House.
The office of Speaker of the House of the United States House of Representatives is hereby declared vacant.
This is the first time that the speakership has been successfully vacated by that body. And what does this have to do with my work and the presidency? Leaving the politics of Kevin McCarthy and the current state of affairs aside for a moment, if you are able, the Speaker of the House is listed by law as third in line of presidential succession, right behind the Vice President of the United States. That is to say, if something were to happen to the President and Vice President of the United States, the Speaker of the House of Representatives would become President. So what is this presidential line of succession, and how might it, in theory, work should it need to be used? Let's take a deep dive. While there are multiple places that the United States Constitution mentions the way in which succession might happen if it were needed, the original framers of the Constitution didn't lay out clear ground rules on a plan if it were needed to be enacted and how it might take hold. That is to say, when President William Henry Harrison became our first president to die in office in 1841, there were questions whether Vice President John Tyler was actually President of the United States or just a placeholder for the presidency until another election could happen. President Tyler sure thought that he was president, and so did his First Lady. So much so that she established the tradition of having Hail to the Chief, the song you heard in our intro, played every time President Tyler entered the room, and that's a tradition that held even until today. Some of this confusion would be cleared up with amendments to the Constitution, but as the years wore on, the question became apparent that if foreign or domestic powers tried to decapitate the government by taking out both the president and the vice president, what would happen? This led to the 1947 passage of the Presidential Succession Act. The act gives order of precedence, which many countries have, by which the office would be filled. Of course, it starts with the Vice President of the United States, followed by the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and then the President pro tem of the Senate. After that begins the cabinet line of succession, starting with the Secretary of State, followed by the Treasury and Defense Secretaries, respectively. Then it weaves its way through the rest of the cabinet. How did they determine the order of the line of succession for cabinet members? It was based on the order of the establishment of the department secretaries and how they oversee their cabinet agencies. That means that the Secretary of State oversees the oldest federal department in the cabinet, and it would follow the line of succession all the way back to where, if necessary, the Secretary of Homeland Security would take office. This was established because the Department of Homeland Security started soon after the September 11th attacks and was codified in the Presidential Succession Act in 2006. That said, the person in the cabinet may not meet the official guidelines for being president, meaning they could be under 35. They may not have lived in the United States for 14 years, or they may not be a natural-born citizen of this country. In that case, they are still ineligible to be considered for the presidency, and they would be skipped in the line of succession. We currently have a few of those in our cabinet right now, actually, including the current Secretary of Homeland Security is considered ineligible for the presidency of the United States. 9 vice presidents have engaged the succession of the presidency. 8 due to the deaths of their office holders, and 1, Gerald Ford, due to the resignation of the president that he was vice president for, Richard M. Nixon. Because of how Gerald Ford was appointed by his office, he is the only president to have served, but neither have been elected by president or vice president by popular vote or electoral college vote in our country. 3 vice presidents temporarily assumed office while sitting presidents underwent medical procedures. Those include Vice President George H.W. Bush for President Ronald Reagan, Vice President Dick Cheney for President George W. Bush, and Vice President Kamala Harris for President Joe Biden. Since our nation's inception, there has thankfully been no need to enact succession beyond the act of that of the vice presidency. And there are obviously some problems with the Presidential Succession Act. I've already mentioned a few above, like, for instance, a cabinet secretary being ineligible. Wouldn't that be awful if we got all the way to them and they were ineligible to be president of the United States? And for instance, during the State of the Union, the president must choose a designated survivor, which just sounds so awful, not to attend the speech so that the continuity of government might continue should the Capitol building come under attack and the government be decapitated. Secondly, while the current president pro tem of the Senate, Patty Murray from Washington, is 72, we've had Senate pro tems like Strom Thurmond, who was 98, and the recent one, Chuck Grassley, he is 90 years old. That creates serious questions about the succession and ability to govern, given the age that many who hold this largely ceremonial position. Finally, we work also under the assumption that the cabinet members would want this position. Would Secretary Antony Blinken, our current Secretary of State, who's been a career politician, really want to be president? He's given his life to the State Department. Is that something he would really want to move over to the White House? I don't know if I would. This also requires us to examine whether acting secretaries would be considered in the line of succession were something to occur. And acting secretaries are a very normal thing given the politics and parameters of our government right now. All that's to say, we unequivocally hope this never happens. However, for the sake of our republic, this is something we must consider, and I'm thankful that our elected leaders have considered all of the possibilities and parameters that we have to work through in order to make sure that this nation would long endure. I hope you found this episode helpful. Let me know if you have questions on my website at www.roblee4.com/contact. Check out our presidential database where we have information on the phase and policies of the United States presidents at www.roblee4.com/presidents. And I'm happy to dive into topics that you might feel useful for your knowledge. Our next episode, coming up later this week, will be on President John Quincy Adams, our nation's 6th president. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon.
You've been listening to So Help Me Pod, a podcast of Beloved Journal in conjunction with Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. The podcast is offered in partial completion of the Doctor of Ministry degree for the Reverend Robert W. Lee. All opinions and insights offered are solely owned by that of those who offered them and do not reflect the views of stakeholders in the project. There have been 45 men and 46 presidential administrations, all of them unique. Some of them have been more interesting than others, some of them more terrifying than others. All have been part of the grand expression of democracy on the North American continent and part of the wider conversation of self-governance in the world. These men have failed profoundly, and we have failed profoundly in following their leadership along with our own sometimes antiquated and backwards ways of viewing and acting in the world. That said, this form of leadership is unlike few other, and the greatest gift we have has been given in the ways in which the American experiment continues to prosper despite our terrible misgivings. We are better off because of these men, and we are forever in their debt. For more information, visit www.roblee4.com/presidents.